Malkeinu, Chatanu lefanecha, Avinu Malkeinu, Chamol aleinu, V'alol aleinu, V'tapeinu, Avinu Malkeinu.
Whilst we may be apart tonight, our community was founded on and is sustained by the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners and their elders, past, present and emerging, who have cared for this land as custodians. We also acknowledge that this land is, was and always will be traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We affirm the mutual respect that has developed between Australian and Torres Strait Islander and Jewish people, and the importance of spirituality and the relationship to land. Australia has provided a home for our Jewish community, and we acknowledge our obligation to respect the land on which we live. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, here in person at Moriah College, on the North Shore at Masada College, and online from wherever you may be watching. On behalf of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies and our partners, the JCA, the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, COA, Courage to Care, the Sydney Jewish Museum, and Youth Here, I welcome you all to this year's commemoration of Yom HaShoah, in particular, the survivors who are here tonight. We are honoured to be joined this evening, both in person and online, by a number of special guests, including the Honourable Dominic Perrottet MP, the Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Scott Farlow MLC, Chair of the New South Wales Parliamentary Friends of Israel, the Honourable Walt Secord MLC, Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Parliamentary Friends of Israel, the Honourable Mark Curey MP, Minister for Multiculturalism, the Honourable David Elliott MP, Minister for Transport and Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable Gabrielle Upton MP, the Honourable Catherine Cusack MLC, the Honourable Peter Poulos MLC, Mr Stephen Camper MP, Dr Marjorie O'Neill MP, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek MP, Dave Sharma MP, the Honourable Matt Thistlethwaite MP, representatives from the consulates of Austria, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Lithuania, New Zealand and Turkey, councillors from Canterbury Bankstown Council, the Hills Shire Council, Hornsby Shire Council, the Northern Beaches Council, North Sydney Council, Ku-ring-gai Council, Randwick City Council, Waverley Council, Willoughby Council, Wollongong Council and Woollahra Council, representatives from our friends in the interfaith and NGO communities, rabbis and leaders of Jewish communal organisations, schools and synagogues. Thank you for joining our community to mark this important occasion. We pray for the safety of all innocent people caught up in the atrocities in the Ukraine, and our thoughts are especially with the Jewish community there. With each passing year, and as we mourn the loss of our dear Holocaust survivors, the importance of sharing stories of survival becomes our responsibility. Those of us who have borne witness to their testimonies firsthand. The strength and determination required by survivors to share their oral testimony, reliving the horrors of their experiences over and over again, is unmatched. As a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, the importance of sharing the stories of survival is even more poignant and personal for me and my family this year. In 2019, my late grandmother, Lily Berger, joined us at our communal commemoration to light a memorial candle in honour of the 6 million Jews and the members of her family who perished in the Holocaust. This year, our family commemorates Yom HaShoah for the first time without her by our side. We owe a debt of gratitude to those who have borne the weight of Holocaust education and remembrance throughout history, and acknowledge the importance of our role as future generations in ensuring we become the storytellers. Thank you to each and every one of you for joining us this evening, for being a part of this important commemoration, for showing solidarity and helping us keep the stories of survival alive. Thank you.
In the past year, our community has lost many of its treasured Holocaust survivors. With ever fewer survivors remaining, we must take every opportunity to hear and learn from those who are still with us. This imperative led to tonight's theme, keeping alive the stories of survival. Survivors have told their stories in a myriad of ways, through survivors of the Shoah video testimonies in the 1990s, through inspiring students and adults at the Sydney Jewish Museum, or through Courage to Care, through sharing with their grandchildren what they went through for school history projects. For some survivors, it took decades before they felt comfortable sharing their testimonies. Other survivors were never able to relive the horrors of the Holocaust and revive the memories of losing those dearest to them. We must recognise the enormous courage that it takes for survivors to speak of their suffering during the Holocaust. Tonight, we will hear from several Holocaust survivors, those who survived concentration camps, those who survived in hiding or working with the underground, those who survived through the good deeds of righteous among the nations. In keeping alive the stories of survival, it is survivors who have confronted their trauma to allow us to gain an understanding of their horrific experiences. The rest of us have the easier part, retelling survivor stories as tonight's Next Generation speaker does, visiting or researching the places that the survivors lived, reading, listening to or watching testimonies, as we are honoured to do tonight. Olga Horak OAM epitomises tonight's theme of keeping alive the stories of survival. She was born Olga Rosenberger in Bratislava, then part of Czechoslovakia, in 1926. In a moment, we will hear Olga's incredible story of survival in her own words. Olga was one of the founders of the Sydney Jewish Museum, where she has shared her survival story for 30 years. Olga was also a founding member of the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants, and she has written a memoir entitled Auschwitz to Australia. Olga has been determined to share her story of survival and educate generations of Australians about the atrocities of the Holocaust. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our community's true remaining treasures, Holocaust survivor Olga Horak OAM.
I was 29 kilos. I was desperately sick, but my mind was clear. When people talk about 6 million Jewish people were murdered, and please, if I hear somebody talk about 6 million Jews died in Auschwitz, nobody died in Auschwitz. Nobody died during the Holocaust. People were murdered, people perished. You cannot be accurate when you count in millions. There were many, many more who are not accounted for, like my mom. We had a farm. It was beautiful. There was a small house. We had a very beautiful lifestyle at home. I had only one sister. And, you know, the family was very close. It was very difficult to accept the restrictions because we were the first country affected, and Slovakia was created into a self-governing puppet republic. The president accepted immediately the Nazi Nuremberg laws. The law was introduced without warning that all 16 years old Jewish boys and Jewish girls will be collected and taken away. The SS guards came, my sister was on the list. They collected her, took her away, and we never saw her again. I was devastated. My sister was only 1.5 years my senior, and we were growing up together like twins. I wasn't a teenager. I was deprived of the best years in my life, my childhood, my happy childhood in a happy family surrounding. And later on, of course, even my young adult years were severely affected. A lady who was our next-door neighbor, she was a very intelligent woman, a pharmacist. She had her pharmacy next door where we lived. The good friend brought the guards there one morning and denounced us. We were in Seret, in that collection camp. I think it could have been maybe 2 weeks, and it soon became overcrowded. And one morning, they took us out from the barracks, and we marched to the railway line, and there were the cattle carriages waiting for us. And we were pushed into these cattle carriages, maybe 100 people in one, overcrowded, filthy, smelly. Once we were inside, we just fell over each other. There was no room even to sit down. They locked from outside, they bolted the carriages, and we were on the way to Auschwitz. And they opened up the doors. We were actually blinded by the sunlight or the daylight. Dr. Joseph Mengele was in charge to select people from the human cargo arriving on a daily basis. And with his finger, he showed which side to go. The people looking fit were shown to the right side with the finger. On the left side, the people were taken to the gas chambers and were killed. Never saw my father again. Never saw him again. Never saw my grandma again. My mom came in front of Dr. Mengele. She was only 39 years old. Healthy looking. She was shown to the right side. So was I behind her. I was with my mom together, and that was the biggest moral support I could have had. Now, when we came into Birkenau, before we were taken into our barracks, we were put into different groups, and one of the couples, these girls from the very first transport, some of them became couples in charge of all the other inmates, and some of them were very cruel indeed. And I recognized one of them. She was a schoolmate from my sister, in the same transport with my sister, and she was screaming, and she had a whip, and I sang out to her. I said, "Etta, what are you doing?" She recognized me, and she said, "I'm not a human anymore." As a young girl, I did not believe in bad people. I don't even believe today in bad people, but I lost my belief when I saw these horrible people without any feelings. And we not only had men as people guards, we also had women. And they were just as cruel as their menfolk. And you know, that was very hard for me to believe, because some of these guards were family people. They had wives, they had children. They went home and they sat down and ate a meal together, but there was no compassion. Nothing was ever shown to us. It was just the beginning of winter. It was very, very cold, and we had to march to a forest about 10 kilometers away every morning. And there we had to dig trenches for the Nazi army. One morning we were told not to go to the forest, not to march there. We had to march on the highway. And that was the beginning of the death march. It was a horrible, horrible thing to describe, because we were already marching skeletons. Whoever wanted to have a rest was shot immediately. We arrived in Dresden after having marched for hundreds of kilometers. Dresden was bombarded down to the ground. Believe it or not, the guards left us unattended. They ran into shelters with their dogs, and we were left outside, and we were not scared. We looked up and we saw the bombs, and we said, "That is manna from heaven." Of course, after the air raid, the guards returned, and we were transported to Bergen-Belsen. And Bergen-Belsen was liberated 3.5 weeks before the end of the war. Some people cried from happiness, they realized. Some people were hysterically laughing, and some people couldn't speak. We couldn't react at all. At that time, we were already zombies. The next day, the British officers wanted to know who we were, where we will be repatriated to, because they knew already it will be the end of the war. And my mom came to the table. She gave her registration, her information. They gave her a registration card. It was called a DP card, disposed person. She held it in her hand, and she collapsed, and I lost her there and then. I was devastated, still am. They took her away, and I never knew where she was buried or. I was somehow lying out in the open. I was unable to get up. I talked about the couple who I saw in Auschwitz, Etta, and I saw her walking past, and she had that blanket in her hand, and she saw me, and she threw the blanket at me, and that's how I inherited that blanket. That blanket was made in Auschwitz, woven in Auschwitz by inmates for the SS people from human hair and recycled old fibers. That blanket I had with me until I was repatriated myself, and that blanket finished up in the Sydney Jewish Museum. It is the only blanket of such colors and pattern in the world, because they were never two alike. People tell you, why don't you forget? Don't live in the past. What can I reply to that? I can never forget. Neither do I want to forget. I would feel guilty if I forget. The past lives in me. You can never, ever get rid of these horrible, sad moments which one had to endure. I don't need to forget. No, I don't want to forget. And I don't want the people to forget. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we are assembled here on the United Holocaust Memorial Day. Today's commemoration attests to the fact that 6 million innocent lives were murdered. They did not die. They were brutally killed in gas chambers or having been tortured. They were victims to a tragedy whilst the world stood still in the 20th century. We mourn and we light 6 candles to remember our beloved ones. We observe Yom HaShoah in their memory. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I survived 5 camps and a death march. Yes, I was there. I am a witness. The Nazis' aim was to destroy all Jewish people, but prove them wrong. I'm alive. I'm here today. This is a personal triumph. No effort or neglect should be needed to document the Shoah. I never hide the truth and suffering I endured. History cannot and should never be erased. I would hate myself to forget. I would feel guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, please always remember, please do not ever forget. Thank you. Okay.
Who's standing up for you, Olga?
Never make things strange. One has a way of passing by so fast, like a fleeting shadow no one will recall the faces of the past. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Yet one thought gives me comfort, that's all that I have left, for I know that God in heaven won't forget. Won't forget.
My paternal grandmother, Elizabeth Fishman, my Bergie Nana, didn't speak much about her experience during the Holocaust, but there was one thing that she did repeat over and over again. Even if you spent just half an hour in Auschwitz and then lived a life of total luxury, you would never ever forget. My grandmother spent 8 months in Auschwitz and by any account did go on to live a life of relative luxury, and she never forgot. She cried a lot. She had nightmares. She took medication to calm her nerves. She had 5 sisters. 4 of them survived alongside her. They survived Auschwitz, and then they survived living with the trauma for the rest of their lives. I grew up hearing snippets of memory from Holocaust survivors on both sides of my family. I heard about my grandmother's oldest sister, Motsi, who settled in the United States after the war. Her 2 small children were murdered by the Nazis, and for years she would visit playgrounds looking for them, holding on to a sliver of hope that maybe, somehow, they had survived and might be playing on a swing set in Western Pennsylvania. I heard about my grandmother's younger sister, Yoli, who, while on the death march in January 1944, decided she couldn't go any further and sat down in the snow. Waiting until her sisters had walked far enough ahead of her so they wouldn't see her get shot, she squeezed her eyes tightly closed and waited for the inevitable. But something else happened. She heard the voice of an SS officer behind her. "Girl, get up. The Russians are close. It won't be long now." I heard about my maternal grandmother, Irenka, who in the spring of 1944 was living in Budapest and had plans to return home to the little village of Mértelek to celebrate Passover with her mother and 5 siblings. Her young nieces and nephews had learned the Manishtana. That Seder never happened. The Nazis liquidated Mértelek 1 week before Passover, sending her mother, 2 of her sisters, and the children to their deaths in Auschwitz. These images stay with me. I play them over and over in my mind. I somehow remember them, almost as if I was there. The thought of murdered children more painful than ever since becoming a mother myself 6 months ago. I tell my family story to school students as part of my involvement as a board member of 3GNY, an organisation established by and for the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors based in New York, where I've lived for much of the last 10 years. Founded in 2005 by 6 original members, today our membership exceeds 5,000. We have diverse social programs, including museum tours, film screenings, discussion groups, and an annual Shabbat dinner. But our flagship initiative, and what we are most proud of, is the We Do program, which trains grandchildren of survivors to learn and share their grandparents' story with public school students. To date, 3GNY has trained over 350 speakers, and in the past 12 months alone, our speakers have presented in 110 classrooms across 49 schools, reaching over 4,000 students. With a keen awareness that we are only a few short years away from a time where there will sadly be no more first-hand testimony of the Holocaust, we take our mission of educating about the perils of intolerance very seriously and are very proud of our work. 3GNY has also helped guide the establishment of new groups in Washington, D.C., Miami, Baltimore, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Arizona, and hopefully soon Sydney. When I tell my family stories in schools, I often ask the students who they think is responsible for the Holocaust. The first answers are, of course, Hitler, the Nazis, Germany. But eventually we come to the role played by so-called innocent bystanders or ordinary citizens. And so I read them this quote from British journalist Hugh Carlton-Green of the Daily Telegraph, who was present on Kristallnacht, widely acknowledged by historians as the night the Holocaust began. He wrote, "I have seen several anti-Jewish outbreaks in Germany during the last 5 years, but never anything as nauseating as this. Racial hatred and hysteria seem to have taken complete hold of otherwise decent people. I saw fashionably dressed women clapping their hands and screaming with glee, while respectable middle-class mothers held up their babies to see the fun." Kristallnacht was a turning point. That night, a massive chasm appeared, an uncrossable gulf between what had been and what would never be the same again, between humanity and atrocity. And just like a pothole that seems to suddenly swallow a car, the violence that erupted on Kristallnacht also seemed sudden, but was foreshadowed by a million tiny cracks in the pavement that were unnoticed or went ignored. The man who told a seemingly innocent Jewish joke at the dinner table, the boy advised by his parents that it would be better if he no longer played with his Jewish neighbour, the Jewish-owned department stores tacitly blamed for the closure of smaller stores owned by non-Jews, and ultimately the Nuremberg laws that severely restricted Jewish freedom in Germany, all of which occurred in full view of the average person who turned a blind eye. So in the classroom, we talk about ways the students can step in early and often, wherever small injustices are found, on the playground, in the classroom, on the street, because that is the easiest and most effective time to act. By the time Kristallnacht occurred, it was well and truly too late to stop what would lead to the death of 6 million Jews and so many others. We also talk about resilience. I spend a lot of time wondering how my grandparents survived the Holocaust, but perhaps even more time wondering how they survived living with the memories, how they kept going, what kept them strong, how they came to terms with the fact that they were victims of humanity's darkest hour. I never really got an answer until my grandmother's funeral in 2013, when during the eulogy, Rabbi Friedman of Central Synagogue referred to her faith. A faith that wasn't necessarily a faith in God, but an undeniable faith in life. A faith that allowed her to pick up the pieces, move to Australia, a very strange country halfway across the world, raise a family, and most importantly, continue to identify as a Jew no matter what form that identification took. My grandmother, who experienced unfathomable trauma in the early years of her life because she was Jewish, lived to the age of 90 and never let go of her Jewishness. She never gave up. She wasn't a victim. She was a hero. She was the epitome of strength, the strength with which our people endure, our commitment to ourselves and to humanity, our continued pursuit of our identity even in the face of utter destruction, the joy Judaism continues to bring us in a world where many deem religion unnecessary, and most importantly, what Judaism teaches about welcoming the stranger, about justice, and about healing a broken world. A number of years ago, I wrote a show that was born out of a deep desire to bring myself closer to my grandparents' experiences. It's called Club Gelber Stern, and it explores the someone I might have been if I was living in Europe in the 1930s. Set in Berlin in 1933, it tells the story of a Jewish cabaret star who is performing her final night on stage as the Nazis take power. I performed the show at the New York Music Theatre Festival, and each night before the curtain went up, I would think about my grandmother, who had passed away just the year before. I wondered what she would have thought of my performance. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, my creation of this piece of art might have been able to alleviate some of her pain, to make up for some of her suffering. My immediate second thought was how foolish that was. Nothing could assuage the pain that she and my other grandparents experienced during the Holocaust. But I did imagine telling her, Nana, this is not what Hitler intended. When he sent you to the camps, he did not for a second think that years later, your proud, strong, free, and fiercely Jewish granddaughter would be on stage in a city with a thriving Jewish population, leading an audience in a song that mimicked, mocked, and ridiculed him. Nor did he intend the Seder that I went to in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, hosted by my cousin Michelle and attended by 80 of my relatives, all the descendants of those who weren't able to gather in Meitalek for Passover in 1944. A family tree was painted on the wall. The trunk, my great-grandmother and grandfather, Roji and Isidor Grosinger, who I imagined were watching over us that night, smiling proudly as they heard the Manishtana sung by some of their 32 great-great-grandchildren. So while my grandparents are at peace, Hitler is rotting in a non-existent grave. He failed. The fight, however, is far from over. In a world where anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, war crimes, and demonization of the other is still very much alive, my prayer is that we channel our faith in ourselves, in our Jewishness, and in our humanity, so that we can be beacons of light that shine brightly wherever there is discrimination, intolerance, and bullying, even as our own community continues to be its target. Let us stand tall and fight against hatred, fear, and indifference, and do whatever we can to ensure that the memory of the Holocaust and all that it can teach us is kept alive for many generations to come. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Egon Sonnenschein. I'm a Holocaust survivor. Tonight, I will be speaking how a Muslim family by the name of Prochich saved the life of my cousin Aviva. My uncle Victor Coleman, a pharmacist, was killed by the Nazi German soldiers in a forest during a battle. He was in the resistance movement in Croatia. My aunt Helena was killed by the Croatian Nazis, the Ustashi. Their little one-year-old baby, Aviva, was taken by Dr. Avdo Prochich to his mother, Esme, house where he also lived. They were good friends of Helena and Victor. They hid and took good care of her. A few months later, they were told by friends that Ustashis were looking for a Jewish child. It became too dangerous for her to remain in the town of Gračanica. Dr. Avdo arranged for Aviva to be taken with the youngest brother, Rukib, to the eldest brother, Sabria, and his wife, Sapeta, living in Zagreb, the capital city where Sabria owned 7 houses. She stayed with their 3 children and was moved around to different hiding places when it was dangerous. See the photos of Aviva with the 3 Muslim nannies. When we returned to Yugoslavia after the war in 1945, my parents went to Croatia and found that all my mother's relatives were murdered, except for the 3-year-old Aviva. We adopted her. She is my sister. We immigrated to Israel, South Africa, and finally Australia. About 8 years ago, Reichan Prochich, a descendant and investigating journalist, found us through Genie after 12 years of search. His grandmother asked him to find out what happened to Aviva, where she now lives, and if she was well. We were in touch and found him pleasant and caring. My wife Miriam and I went to Europe and visited Reichan and his family in Gračanica. Later, Aviva and her husband Louis also met the family. I suggested to Aviva that we should nominate the Prochich family for the award of the Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. She agreed, but said that I had to do all the work. Yad Vashem gave me the instruction what evidence we must provide. The qualifying condition was that the award could only be given to non-Jewish people who had endangered their lives and their families to save Jews without receiving any monetary or other compensations. A judge of the Supreme Court in Israel would be checking all the evidence thoroughly. I sent a total of 21 submissions. Yad Vashem required additional photos of Aviva with Prochich family during the war, and any correspondence between us after the war, but we could not find any. Yad Vashem advised me that Aviva's evidence could not be considered as her recollection was hearsay. Evidence from members of the Prochich family were not valid as they would be recipient of the award. There was not enough evidence. I emailed back that my evidence should count. As I was 15 years old when we returned, that I remembered all the details well and that the Prochich family definitely deserves the award. After 6 months, Dr. Avdo, Esme, Sabria, and his wife Safeta were awarded the prestigious title of Righteous Among the Nations. The award ceremony was held in the hall attached to the Sarajevo synagogue. 7 ambassadors, 12 high priests, and over 35 descendants of the Prochich family were present. They were very happy and proud. Rehan received the award from the Israeli ambassador from Albania on behalf of the descendant of the Prochich family. On the screens are the photos of Rehan, Aviva, Fox, and me, certificate of honor, medal with the inscription, "Whoever saves a life saves the entire universe." A plaque from Aviva thanking the Prochich family for saving her life at the Sydney Jewish Museum. There were interviews, many television channels, and radio commentators present. The award was celebrated with sumptuous lunch and dinner. One of the best results was that it brought Muslim and Jewish people in Bosnia closer together. The entire experience was inspiring, satisfying, and uplifting. Holocaust was real. It was the worst genocide in the history of humanity. It is important that we keep the Holocaust stories alive. I light this candle in honor of 57 righteous among the nations in Bosnia and over 28,000 worldwide.
Action. What was your family life before the Holocaust?
I was born in Milan, Italy.
I was born in Łódź, Poland.
It was an ordinary middle-class family living in Belgrade.
I was born in 1925 into a working-class family.
And every Saturday afternoon, we went up to my grandfather, and he tested us on the Parsha, the Rashi, and everything about that, till, of course, the war broke out.
I was 6 years old when the war started, and the real Holocaust started for us. I was 8 years old.
Now I think I'm going to pick up another question. Do I have a specific memory as a child?
I think that my strongest memory is having survived 3 times a mortal danger. And always being rescued, not by a friend, but rescued by enemy.
We're on a milice list. The Germans had their Gestapo, the French had the milice, and we were warned that we're on this list. We had no time to pick up clothing, pick up a bit of water, or anything. We left immediately. We were warned, and we went into a forest, and that's how we were able to save ourselves.
They start shooting, and anybody who would run out of the train got killed. And the one who was stuck in the train survived, and he moved on for another day till we come to Tutzing, where again the Germans disappeared, and nobody moved anymore. And then about a half an hour later, American jeeps with young American soldiers come along and start throwing chocolates to us and said, you're free.
Your turn, Gaby, to ask the question.
Okay. How did you start your life again after the Holocaust?
Firstly, I've been in the Hungarian Jewish underground until the end of the war. Surprisingly, the head of the liberating Russian army, Malinovsky, picked a handful of Jews and put it in the re-establishing Hungarian police force, including me. And you know why? Because his second name was Jakobski.
That was quite hard because we came home, we didn't have anything, we were in rags. Some good people gave us some rooms. My father came back 2 years later from Russia. We were together with Grandma and Grandpa. I started my education. We were on rations, and I still didn't have coat or new shoes.
It was hard for us. My family had lost everything, so it was really very difficult.
In Feldafing, I met a girlfriend, a girl of 15, but I married her 2 years later, and so on and so on. There's lots of stories to it.
What does it mean to you to have survived the Holocaust?
It means that I'm here, and this continuity. I have 3 children, I have 11 grandchildren, and I'm delighted that I have had that opportunity to recreate a family that was so decimated.
I survived the Holocaust by pure luck, because 1.5 million children did not survive.
Exceptional
luck.
Exceptional luck.
I was convinced that I am going to survive. Not only survive, but to fight.
Why did you decide to speak about the Holocaust?
It's my duty to tell before the denial is overpowering.
That is a trigger, and we have something to do. It is very important to do it.
And I'm a witness to it, as a few of us left, who are saying it did happen, and it must never happen again to anyone.
I never cry, I cannot cry, and I cannot laugh, you know? So it's with me all the time.
Why did you think it is important for children to learn about the Holocaust?
The most important learning from the Holocaust and the stories, what we are telling for the student, that never happen again.
I think the children and grown-ups that should learn about tolerance. Not so much about the Holocaust, but about tolerance.
And the biggest possession what they can have is what they learn, because that nobody can take from them. And that is for every war, to everyone to learn.
Why is it important to commemorate the Holocaust?
Our aim is make people remember. Not only just remember, but even learn. And hopefully they make them a better human being through that.
My cousin, Janci, my grandmother, Mariška, my aunties, they can talk and I can talk.
Yom HaShoah, worldwide, people are doing this, and I'm part of a group of people that are disappearing fast. And I think while we can do it, we should do it. And there will be continuity. Our children and grandchildren, hopefully, will continue this for many years to come, because it's a message to humanity worldwide.
Lighting the first candle tonight is Jack Meister. Jack was born in Kielce, Poland in 1928. Jack recalls as a child he led a simple, happy life with traditional Jewish values. He was 11 years old when the Nazis invaded. In March 1941, Jack's family was sent to the Kielce ghetto. Jack was ordered to do the menial, dirty jobs, as he was a strong young boy and a good worker. These jobs included helping on building sites, cleaning out sewers, cleaning streets, and taking headstones off Jewish graves and using them to pave footpaths. In August 1942, the ghetto was liquidated. When Jack came back from forced labour the day after liquidation, he found his family was gone. Until recently, Jack did not know what happened to them. Jack was transported to Radom labour camp and worked in a factory for a year before being transported to Auschwitz. At the end of 1944, Jack was sent on a death march to Buchenwald. Many did not survive. In April 1945, Buchenwald was liberated by American soldiers. After spending 2 years rehabilitating in Switzerland after liberation, Jack immigrated to Australia at the end of 1949. Jack met and married his wife in the Maccabean Hall, now the Sydney Jewish Museum, and has been a volunteer at the museum since its inception nearly 30 years ago. Tonight, Jack lights a candle in memory of his family and for the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Lighting the second candle is Joe Symon. Joe was born in 1925 in Budapest, Hungary. As a 19-year-old, he was called up for forced labour. Fit and headstrong, Joe initially refused and rebelled against the restrictions placed on Jews. Under threat of punishment, he was later forced to go in June 1944. A few months later, Joe managed to escape and joined the Hungarian resistance. Listening to forbidden radio stations such as Voice of America and Free Europe, he heard details about the concentration camps and gas chambers and became determined to fight the Germans and sabotage their actions at all costs. If he was going to face death, he would die with dignity. Joe sabotaged roundups, smuggled Jews out of the ghettos, and even organised food for starving children in hiding, despite food shortages and restrictions. The only way for him to defend the future of his people was to fight for it. Joe moved to Israel after the war before immigrating to Australia in 1959, where he has lived a full life with his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Joe lights this candle tonight in honour of his family and the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Lighting the third candle is Anna de Leon. Anna was born in Subotica in the former Yugoslavia in 1935. In 1943, Yugoslavia was occupied and Anna's father was taken to forced labour. Anna could no longer attend primary school, where she was in the 2nd grade. In 1944, she and her family were transferred to the ghetto, which was overcrowded. Anna, her mother and grandparents were transported in cattle cars to Auschwitz. Other members of the extended family died when their train was hit by bombs from Allied forces. In December 1944, Anna's family was transported to a subcamp of Bergen-Belsen in Germany, where conditions were again very harsh. In April 1945, Anna's family again boarded a train and travelled for several days with little food or water. They woke one morning to find the German guards had disappeared and the Americans arriving to liberate them. Anna, then only 9, and her family returned to Subotica in September 1945 to learn that they had lost everything. Anna immigrated to Australia with her husband Gaby in 1971. Anna lights this candle in memory of her family and the 6 million victims of the Shoah. Lighting the fourth candle is Gaby de Leon. Gaby was born in 1927 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. During the war years, Yugoslavia was attacked and occupied by 4 different countries: Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Gaby had 2 near-fatal encounters with the Croatian police. One when he was taken a hostage as a Jew in Sarajevo, but released only after a few days because he was a minor. And the second when he was caught at the border with false documents arranged by his mother in a Muslim name. In both cases, he was luckily saved by unknown individuals. During the Holocaust, Gaby lost his father when he was shot on his way to pick up Gaby's sister in Belgrade. The majority of his extended family perished in concentration camps in Croatia. He survived with his mother and 2 brothers as civilian internees in Italy. After the war, Gaby and his mother returned to Belgrade, where he later met and married fellow survivor Anna. Gaby lights this candle tonight in memory of his family and the 6 million victims of the Shoah. Lighting the 5th candle is Sam Young. Sam was born in 1925 in Lodz, Poland. Before Sam and his family were taken to the Lodz ghetto, where they suffered terrible conditions, his life was a story of family, plentiful food, holidays, and schooling. In July 1944, from Lodz ghetto, he and his family were transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau after 3 days of travel in a cattle train. On arrival, his mother was sent to her death, and he later learned of his father's death too. Sam estimates that he lost 100 other relatives during the Holocaust. Thereafter, in October 1944, he was sent to Kaufering concentration camp. Liberation eventually came on a railway line in Bavaria, Germany. For Sam and his brother Steve, life had to go on. Sam met his late wife in a displaced persons camp. They came to Australia in 1947, where they had 2 children and began their own business. Sam is now retired and is able to live life. He volunteers in the museum library and enjoys a happy life with his partner Margot. Tonight, Sam lights this candle in memory of his parents and for the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Shoah. Lighting the 6th candle is Olga Horak, whose amazing story of survival we have already heard. Following liberation and the lengthy recuperation, Olga returned to Bratislava and met her future husband John, who she married in 1947. Together, they eventually obtained permits to Australia, where they, almost immediately, established a women's fashion business in Sydney and started their family. As Dane mentioned earlier, Olga was one of the founding members of the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants and the Sydney Jewish Museum, where she's still an active survivor guide for visitors and school groups. Olga lights this candle tonight in memory of her family and the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust.
rachamim shoyechein b'meroimim dayan almonois mavi yesoyimim hametzay menachon choyna al kanefay hashechino b'maloi sekdoishim utoyerim kezoyar horakiya meirim umazirim lini shemois sheishes hamilyonim achenu va'achyo yiseinu rivevois alfei Yisroel anoshim nashim v'tav sheneregu שנשחטו שנשרפו שנחנקו שנקברו חיים ושומסו בכל מיני מיסויס משונויס ואכזריות בידי הגרמנים הנאצים וישראל יימח שמם ושלחו לו Beseise knofov lo elomim veitroir beteroir hachayim es nishmoson begane ויסקדל ויסקדש שמי רבו בעולמו דברו חירוסי וימליך מלכוסי בחיי חוין ובימי חוין ובחיי לכל בית ישראל בעגלו ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן יהי שמי רבו מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה יזברך וישתבח ויספר וישרמם ויסנסה ויסדור ויסעלה ויסעלול שמי לקודשו בריחו לאילו מן כל ברכוסו ושירוסו תושבחוסו ונחמוסו דמירם בעולמו ואמרו אמן יהי שלום רבו מן שמיים וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן Oise sholem b'mreimov hu ya'aseh sholem aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the Premier and all our special guests for joining us tonight. The Jewish community is grateful for your friendship and for your staunch and loyal support. So thank you very much. To Olga and all the survivors who are here with us tonight, thank you for sharing your incredible stories. We are truly privileged to be here in your presence and to be able to listen to you firsthand. Your legacy lives on in our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, sharing your stories of courage, of sacrifice, and importantly of survival that ultimately shaped our community and this country. As war rages in Europe and the world becomes a very fragile place, it is more important now than ever to do all we can to ensure the stories and the lessons of the past are never forgotten and never repeated. Without these eyewitness accounts, it is impossible to understand the brutality of the Shoah and what humanity is capable of. We must cherish every moment we have with our remaining survivors, hear their stories, record them, photograph them, and share them as broadly as possible. These are the mediums of memory that were so beautifully touched on by youth here last night. As first-hand testimonies become rarer, each year gets a little tougher. But the emotion gets stronger. And your attendance here tonight, each and every one of you, is helping to keep these stories alive. Simply by watching, by listening. As survivors' voices weaken, our voices strengthen. Let our voices speak for those who were silenced and for those who can no longer speak, so that we can all say, never again. We will conclude tonight's commemoration with the partisan song, Advanced Australia Fair, and Hatikva. Please rise.
Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott schimmeln bleiene, verstellen bleie Tag. Kommen wird doch unser Eis gebänkte Schau. Sveta pojkton unsere trott med seinen da. Kommen wird doch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Sveta pojkton unsere trott med seinen da. Von grünen Palmenland bis Land von weißen Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Wein. Und wo gesprotzen ist das Sport von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird auf unser Gwurra, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen ist das Sprotz von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird auf unser Gwurra, unser Mut. So wird die Morgensonne bagillen in uns dem Hain. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit den Feind. Nach euch beisammen wird die Sonne der Kajor. Wie a Parol soll gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Nach euch beisammen wird die Sonne der Kajor. Wie a Parol soll gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Vogel in der Frei. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallende Welt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in der Hand. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallende Welt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in der Hand. Das sagt nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott schimmeln bleien, verstellen bleue Tag. Kommen wird doch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Sie wird abhängt an unser Gott mit seinen da. Kommen wird doch unser ausgebänkte Schau. Sie wird abhängt an unser Gott mit seinen da.
Let us sing together the national anthems, everyone. Advance Australia Fair.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Balevav Pnima Nefesh Yehudi Horia Lefate Mizrach Kadima Ein Letzion Sophia Od lo avta tikvatenu Hatikva bat אלפיים להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון ירושלים להיות עם חופשי בארצנו